First and foremost, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that tonight's conversation is taking place on unceded sovereign land. The event broadcast comes to you from the Wheeler Centre on the lands of the Kulin Nation. We pay respect to their elders past and present and to the elders of all communities this conversation reaches. Welcome to tonight's conversation, hosted by the Australian Pen Centres in Sydney, Melbourne and Perth, Copyright Agency and the Wheeler Centre. My name is Mark Isaacs and I'm the President of Pen Sydney. This evening's discussion is brought to you by the Copyright Agency's Cultural Fund. Without their financial support, this conversation would not be possible. The Cultural Fund also finances the writers who contribute to the biannual Pen Sydney magazine, which you can access online at pen.org.au. I'd like to thank the Copyright Agency for financing important public discussions around freedom of expression and freedom of the press. The Wheeler Centre is Melbourne's home for the discussion, debate and practice of writing and ideas. We are truly blessed to have a cultural cornerstone of Melbourne providing this seamless virtual experience. We are hugely appreciative of the Wheeler Centre for sharing 50% of ticket proceeds from this event with the Australian Pen Centres. The Australian Pen Centres are affiliates of Pen International, a global association of writers. There are 150 Pen International centres worldwide which defend free expression, protect writers at risk, support writers in exile, promote linguistic rights and the written word in all its forms. Since it was established in 1960, the Writers in Prison Committee has investigated the persecution and imprisonment of writers and documented its findings in Pen's annual case list. Member centres of Pen International are active in campaigning for an improvement in the conditions of persecuted writers and journalists and advocate for systemic change to restrictive laws and practices. The Australian Pen Centres are currently assisting the Writers in Prison Committee to investigate the cases of two Australian writers, Yang Hengjun, imprisoned in China, and Carly Moore Gilbert, imprisoned in Iran. In an age of rampant fake news, now more than ever, Australia needs a strong community of writers and readers dedicated to protecting the written word. To support us and our work, please donate to or become members of the Australian Pen Centres. You can find more information at penaustralia.org. Since the 1980s, Pen International has used the empty chair at events to represent a writer who could not be present because they are imprisoned, detained, disappeared, threatened, or killed. Tonight's virtual empty chair represents three members of the Iranian Writers Association, Reza Kandan Mahabadi, Bakhtash Abtin, and Keyvan Bajan. On the 4th of October 2020, the three writers were transferred to Evin Prison in Tehran after an unfair trial and a wrongful conviction. Their imprisonment during the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic has put their lives at serious risk. The writers were imprisoned because of their objection to state censorship and their advocacy for freedom of expression. The Iranian Writers Association has been declared illegal by the Iranian state, and its members have endured ongoing persecution, including arrest, imprisonment, and assassination. According to Bakhtash Abtin, in a country like Iran, death is very cheap for intellectuals, freedom-loving people, and those who fight for freedom of expression. Pen centres in Sydney, Melbourne, and Perth call upon the Iranian government to release the writers immediately. To join the Australian Pen Centre's letter-writing campaigns, please visit our websites. Every year, Pen centres around the world commemorate the Day of the Imprisoned Writer, an international day intended to recognise and support writers who are detained or otherwise persecuted for their opinions, and for writers who are under attack for their peaceful political activities or for the practice of their profession. This day is observed each year on November 15th, which this year falls on this coming Sunday. On the Day of the Imprisoned Writer, we are honoured to have Maria Ressa as our guest. Maria epitomises those courageous writers who speak truth to power and who put their own safety and sometimes their lives on the line for the public good. Maria is the CEO, executive editor, and co-founder of Rappler.com, one of the leading online news organisations in the Philippines. Maria has been honoured around the world for her courageous and bold work in fighting disinformation, fake news, and attempts to silence the free press. In 2018, she was named Time magazine's Person of the Year. She is a recipient of the prestigious Golden Pen of Freedom Award from the World Association of Newspapers and News Publishers, and has received many other awards for her journalism. Fatima Measham is a writer and speaker living on Warrawurrung country. She was formerly a consulting editor, columnist, and podcast producer for Eureka Street, where she focused on issues of social justice, identity, and politics. Her work has appeared in publications such as Meanjin and The Guardian. She grew up on the traditional land of the Higaonon in the Philippine South. It is with great pleasure that I will now hand over to Fatima to begin what will surely be an insightful and thought-provoking conversation.
Thanks, Mark, for that introduction. And I want to thank the audience for taking time to listen to this conversation. I'm speaking to you from Wadarung country, and I want to personally acknowledge the continuing role of First Nations people in the life of our democracy. As this is an event that's in part about truth telling, I want to highlight Indigenous aspirations about the telling of truth, about history and sovereignty. In the lead up to the day of the Imprisoned Writer, I also wish to acknowledge Australia's own history of detaining writers and other creatives who had fled oppressive regimes, including, as noted in Mark's introduction, from Iran. Maria Ressa is out on bail pending appeal after having been convicted of cyber libel. This is only one of 12 cases brought against her over the past 3 years. 8 of these are still in the courts, and if she loses them all, she could be in prison for decades. Maria, this feels like overkill. What got you this attention, and have you regretted anything since?
First, Fatima, thank you. Thank you for this conversation. And my gosh, thank you, Mark and Penn Sydney, because it is incredible that you care. That's the first step, right? It is so hard now to capture people's attentions, and we can talk more about that. But why the overkill, Fatima? I think that the goal of all of this is to make us shut up, right? That's the goal. But it's like, be careful of equal and opposite reactions. The government's cases that they've filed against us, these criminal charges. I'm not just out on bail once, I'm out on bail 8 times. I have 8 arrest warrants, which is insane because I'm not doing anything but being a journalist. That's definitely overkill, right? But look, I think it's had the opposite effect, which is it's really the first arrest that happened in February 2019 unshackled me because I realized I had to fight, not as a journalist, but I had to fight for my rights. I am one citizen. And when the president of the country targets you, says it in a nationwide address, several of them, you just go, okay, that's asymmetrical power there, but I am a citizen. My rights are in the Constitution. And so what it's done is it's really made me realize that I have to stand up for my rights, first as a Filipino citizen, second as a journalist. Freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of the press. These are all in the Philippines Constitution under a Bill of Rights, where our Constitution is like the US. And so I guess it goes down to two effects of the overkill. The first is the Philippine government, wittingly or unwittingly, has unleashed me in a whole different way. It's made me rethink exactly what journalism is. I don't have to go talk to anyone else to know about the abuse of power and to know that the lines have been crossed. I know it. It's experiential. Nothing beats that, right? And then I'm not going to shut up. That's the other part. The attacks came at a time when I am old enough to know the values and what I would give up if I did shut up. And then I think the third part is that this is happening not just in the Philippines. It is happening all around the world. And it is enabled by technology first, And then that technology has helped elect kind of populist authoritarian leaders that have used the digital space to make you doubt the facts, to make you doubt the truth. And that's the problem that reporters, that journalists and writers have right now is it's information chaos. It is an ecosystem that is it's information dystopia. So how do we deal with that? So it's rejuvenated the mission of journalism for me, which is why I became a journalist. By next year, it'll be 35 years. So that's why I became a journalist. And then the second thing is, thank you, Philippine government, for helping me realize we have to redefine exactly what journalism is. It isn't about running after you. It is about holding you to account. But also that with technology and in this information ecosystem, when facts are debated, when the very distribution platforms prioritizes lies laced with anger and hate, so it is biased against facts. When these things happen, journalism becomes activism.
I love how you put it, that it's basically backfired. And I'm thinking, listening to you, that you come from a long tradition of strong Filipino women journalists. Like, this is what I grew up with. I was familiar with some of these names. Letty Jimenez Magsano, Malu Mangaha, Sheila Coronel. These are amazing women that have basically were trailblazers. And so it was really, I grew up being used to seeing women lock horns. So women journalists lock horns with those in power. And it sort of links to with the way I see the Philippines now, where the people who seem to have really collided with the president are women. So Senator Lala de Lima, who is still detained on spurious grounds, Chief Justice, now former Chief Justice Maria Lourdes Sereno has they also got her out of the way, and of course yourself. Are there connections to be made here in terms of the rise of this really abrasive macho leadership with male internet culture, which was made infamous by Gamergate? But also just in terms of how the tech industry leadership itself is dominated by men, and somehow we have to count on them to do the right thing. Are there connections to be made here in terms of the timing and of the overlaps between this a particular kind of masculinity and the way that the internet seems to foster it?
So that's a fantastic question, and it is, and you're right. Women have so we have a database of the information ecosystem on Facebook in the Philippines, and in this database, women are attacked at least 10 times more than men. And I think there are three reasons for this. Right, the first is that it rides on top of the fracture lines of the society. So those who are marginalized become further marginalized. It takes these narratives of division and pounds them open. This is what influence operations do, right? So think about it. Russian military doctrine calls it the fire hose of falsehood. So it's disinformation, but you don't just send one, you send a ton. So it's a fire hose that is impossible to stop. And what do you do with that? You hit the existing fracture line. So those who are marginalized become further marginalized. It's kind of like, this is the positive end, but a Hallmark card will ride on feel good feelings that are there underneath the surface. Well, this is the things you hate or the things you're afraid of, right? And the gender gap is definitely there, right? Sexist. And when you have a leader, and President Duterte isn't the only one like this, but when you have a leader who is sexist at best and misogynistic at worst, then you can complement the bottom-up attacks on social media with top-down, and that will not just weaken and make the vulnerable weaker, but it will also taint the values of the next generation. So all of the wins, the gains of the last few decades since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we are losing it. We are watching the erosion, piece by piece, step by step. So that's the first. And then the second, those are two already. The third thing I think is that the technology itself has biases that are built in, and they are against people of color and they are against women. And I'll just point you to some of the studies that have been done. But in Sundance last January, I watched a film that I think will be released soon or has already been released. It's called Coded Bias, and it's a woman MIT researcher who was doing assignments in MIT on artificial intelligence, and she, because she had a black female face, could not get the artificial intelligence to recognize her facial expressions. She had to actually put a white face mask on, right? I'm just saying, there's the coded bias of the people who built the tech. There is the ingrained inequalities that we have spent decades fighting against, and we thought we had gotten to a point, right, where gender equality, hashtag 2030 now, right, the UN goals. So the last part of this is, and this is something that we studied, is when those two, gender and disinformation, come together. And those are exactly the types of attacks that have been unleashed against Senator Lila de Lima. She is a former Commission on Human Rights, former Justice Secretary. She has been in prison for more than 3 years, since February of 2017. That is how a former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Maria Lourdes Sereno, has been stripped away from the books of the Supreme Court. Her name doesn't even appear on there. All of these attacks combine the weaponization of the law top down with the weaponization of social media. And then, Lenny Robredo, our vice president, an opposition vice president. So that's different. She comes from the political party that was against the political party of President Duterte. Her popularity ratings have gone down. Let's talk about how statistical surveys don't work in today's world anymore. But what we have seen, at least in that, is that she has been the constant target of attacks on social media, gendered disinformation. And that has taken a toll on the way people look at her. It is death by 1,000 cuts, right? That is what we're seeing in our democracy. That is what we are seeing in our rights. And then obviously with me, the same things. And I'll be very straightforward in one narrative that was seeded in 2016 and how it has evolved to 2020, right? The narrative is journalist equals criminal. So if you look at how that was seeded in 2016, I laughed because I thought, yeah, right. I have a track record. Track record doesn't matter on social media because everything is atomized. Meaning is atomized. Context is determined by your algorithmic feed, and it is personal to you, not to anyone else, right? So journalist equals criminal in 2016, exponential by 2017. The president says the same thing. By 2018, the government files cases against us. 2019, I get arrested repeatedly and then get 8 arrest warrants. The cases start. The government's propaganda comes out saying I'm a criminal. And then 2020, in June 15th, I'm convicted along with my former colleague. So what's the reality? Right? What really is the reality? And you can actually now we've gotten to the point that it's normalized and it is kind of like the glass is half empty or half full. It's become debatable. And it never should have been debatable because these charges are politically motivated to prevent journalists from doing our jobs.
There's a couple of things I want to pick up from what you just said, actually, because in terms of disinformation and attacks against journalists, you've been a target, and some of those attacks were actually quite misogynist. But also, there's this weird xenophobia. I just wanted to mention that because it's relevant to Australia, where race is always, very like a contentious area. Some of the comments I've noticed, and every time you appear online, really, the comment threads end up being vitriolic. And there have been there's been doubt cast about whether you're even Filipino. So there are numerous references that you're in fact American, fully like a full American citizen, or that you're even Indonesian because you happen to have worked in Jakarta for some time, right? So I just wanted to put that out there, but also want to move into structural areas. You mentioned the weaponization of the law. I want to explore two areas there. The first one is the idea of unintended or intended consequences. This bears relevance to Australia, where whistleblowers have been intimidated by authorities. Federal police have raided journalists' homes and workplaces. These raise questions around protection, but also I think we don't talk enough about the idea of bad laws. I mean, I guess maybe we do, but we really only just talk about it. Like the law on which you were convicted in June, it's a bad law. It's a poor fit for journalism in the digital age. And it was actually introduced as an amendment by a senator who got pulled up online for plagiarizing. So, can you talk to us a bit in terms of the impact of law on the work that journalists do?
You nailed everything, Look, this cyber libel law was introduced in 2012. And that was the year Rappler was born. And even in 2012, we actually campaigned against the cyber libel law. And I'll send you a video where you can see us, talking about it. And we campaigned against it because there are two things. We were as a country right now, libel is a criminal offense in the Philippines, and that as part of the international law, libel should not be criminalized. And so that was where we were. The cyber libel law, once it was enacted, like just pushed us right back into the dark ages, precisely because it codified it even further, right? I think the second thing is, this really shows you how power can take power and abuse it. Because in the case of the cyber libel, the conviction on June 15th, this is for a story we published 8 years ago when the law we allegedly violated, cyber libel, had not even been in effect, right? So it didn't kick in until 4 months later. It's for a story I didn't write, edit, or supervise. So had nothing to do with it. But this also shows you how it can be weaponized, because really creative ways of even getting us to court, because the statute of limitations for libel is 1 year. Now, in order to even get us to court, the government, the Department of Justice, the judge, actually said that they changed the statute of limitations from 1 year to 12 years. This is all there, right? So be careful when you draft a law, because when a government takes over, which wants to weaponize the law, it can do anything with it. So I think that's the mindset we should have, that protections are there. Look, checks and balances of power is the true mark of a democracy, because as we have seen everywhere around the world, including in countries that were once the beacons of democracy, when you give power and then you add propaganda in this kind of hyper viral behavior modification system way that we have it today, you will influence the people who carry out the power that is vested in them by the people. So I talk about law enforcement, for example, the abuses, where is that line for a policeman in the middle of the riots? Where do they hold back? And when do they shoot? Right? That is personal and it is codified into law. But I'm just saying that this day and age is different, because the forces on that police officer are not institutional. They come in from social media. They are influenced by the propaganda campaigns. And, I sound like a broken record, but truly, we live in a world where the very platforms that we get our news from is literally changing the way we think and the way we behave. And it is insidious manipulation. So that's the context that we live in today. So I'm sorry, to back to your question about the law. Look, the law, just like uh, journalism today, um, it's not just crumbling. It is we're standing on rubble of what it is. And I know that that sounds hyperbolic for Australia, but think about it like this, right? After the pandemic lockdowns, um, when when facts are debatable, which is what the social media platforms have done, it has an impact on governance. It has an impact on who gets elected. It has an impact on the way they normalize actions. If you do not build protections for your truth tellers, there will come a time when you will lose the truth. We already are. So what's happening, what I've learned in the cases I'm facing is the law has been weaponized. I am going to fight it in court precisely because I hope that the men and women who are touching the cases, the judges and the justices, will stick to the spirit of the law, will ignore power plays. My fingers are crossed for that. I have submitted myself to the courts. But having said that, every country also has international law, right? These are the norms. That's what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights creates after humanity almost destroyed itself after the atom bomb in World War II 75 years ago. Countries around the world said we need to come together to protect ourselves, to protect humanity from the worst of what we can do. And that's what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is. What I've learned from Amal Clooney and from Dowdy Street, from Covington, which is they're doing pro bono work for us, is that we need to preserve international law. We need to preserve human rights at this global stage, and we need to make it stronger because as facts disintegrate, as governments, as populist leaders take power and use the levers of democracy to cave it in, the last court of resort is international law, and they're weak today, right? I'm sorry, all of these things tie together for me because I'm hoping that, that the Philippine government, that the Philippines, which is one of the first signatories of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that we will hold tight to these values. Very few speak of values today.
Yeah. Can I move you while we're talking about law, just in terms of how law intersects with technology? Because I always feel that technology outruns the law, and that's how it's always been. But this is not the car replacing the horse. This is not the telegraph being replaced by everything else. There's something fundamental, and I think you've already been sort of pointing to that. There's something fundamental about the way that technology has outrun the law, especially in just thinking about the fact that our social media platforms are actually based in the United States, which is culturally and constitutionally predisposed toward free speech. So in terms of standards, we're living by American standards in terms of what's allowed. Um, I know that I think you're starting to work with people inside the European Union on policy solutions. Is it time to regulate the way that I guess the internet facilitates these forms of speech that are actually undermining democracy?
Yeah, absolutely. Not even a question anymore. Even Mark Zuckerberg himself is asking for better regulation, right? Because he doesn't want to make the choices. But look, the best thing that I love about how we can describe this world comes from a biologist. His quote is fantastic. And I've kind of heard Madeleine Albright say a version of it, but E.O. Wilson said it. He said, we have Paleolithic brains, right? Humanity, we're still the way we are. We think fast, think slow. But our institutions are medieval and we have godlike tech. So I just paraphrased him, right? So think about the manipulation of our weaknesses, which is our cognitive bias, our thinking fast, our emotions. We're manipulated by the platforms. Our institutions are medieval. They don't know how to deal with this. There are no effective regulations that protect the consumer. Think about this like consumer protection laws, right? Because essentially, we're letting pharmaceutical companies do mass tests on people, and when people die, no one's accountable. That's kind of the and then the last part is the tech is godlike. It is, I say that I've said this 3 times, but it's kind of like this, right? We put in our data onto every social media platform, and the social media platform uses machine learning to create a model of who we are. It knows us better than we know ourselves. And then you take artificial intelligence, and because of their extractive business model, they will take our most vulnerable moment to a message. They know that we're vulnerable at that point, and they will sell it. And that can be to a company. So this is not the old style advertising, or it can be to a country, which is what we've seen with Russian disinformation targeting Americans, right? I see this with government officials that are using boosting in the Philippines. So godlike tech. So what happens is that even when we don't take the nudge, the machine learns from us, and it continues to insidiously manipulate us. That's only the advertising part. What about the recommendations, right? The gold, the principle that they used in growth, which is how they nudge us to grow our own network, which then grows the platform's network, right? They've A/B tested this through the years, and they know. So they took behavioral science, neuroscience, and they took tech, and they A/B tested the best way to keep us on their sites, the best way that we will help their platform grow, i.e., make them make money. They recommend friends of friends. Just that one idea for every social media platform, right? When you do that, that's how you create what Eli Pariser called filter bubbles. And in the Philippines, I always say this, because in 2016, facts were not debatable. Before President Duterte was elected, news organizations we're not like the US, we're not fragmented. We're all pretty much in the center because we didn't disagree on facts. And then what happened from 2016 to today, if you're pro Duterte, you grow your network, and then because you're growing your network with friends of friends, you move further right. If you're anti-Duterte, you grow your network with friends of friends, and you move further left. And when you grow your networks, so the growth of the platforms, that's what they want, then coincide with the splintering, the tearing apart of the public sphere. And as you separate, you then have your alternative facts. Someone from the White House used alternative facts. How crazy is that? Right. So these are some of the things I think that I don't think we really understand yet how manipulative the tech is. Because if legislators knew that, if they looked at then they would do something about it. But sorry. So the last part I would say is, we've decided, there are 2 initiatives that I'm doing that really push this forward. The first is the Information and Democracy Forum has a working group on infodemics, because coronavirus, a time when lies kill, right? This makes it imperative. And we put together a former EU Parliament member, Maria Ressa, and I are co-chairs of 16 people who are experts. Like, I vow to their knowledge collectively, and we have 4 papers coming out in November. The papers will look at structural policy recommendations for governments. And there are at least 32 governments that have signed on with this initiative. It is really to try to restore some sense of facts back into our information ecosystem. And then the second one is something that's far more targeted to U.S. elections. It was a month before the U.S. elections on the end of September, the beginning of October. 25 of us, led by Carol Cadwalader, the British journalist who broke the Cambridge Analytica story, and Shoshana Zuboff, she's a Harvard professor emeritus who wrote The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. They pulled us all together and we came out with the real Facebook oversight board. And within like 12 hours, there was an impact of that group because it's an activist organization. This is the part where I learned a ton from the other members who are, the president of the Anti-Defamation League, the CEO, Jonathan Harbour, the Color of Change, the head of that, the NAACP. And I realized how journalists really aren't activists because it's almost, we shackle ourselves, right? But when it is this time period, we really have to do more. I know Mark is far more of an activist than I've ever been, right? Sydney,
Mark Isaac.
Thank you. Yes, Mark Isaac is, thank you for all you are doing, for the work that you do, that here you are in Australia, far away from it, but you realize it impacts your lives as well. So thank you.
But I do want to move on to the idea of the revenue model. Because basically these social media platforms profit of polarization. The shareholders of Facebook and Twitter and YouTube have become rich off of disinformation campaigns, which are now being sponsored by state actors, right?
Yes.
I'm just thinking here in terms of those disinformation campaigns and how they have devalued journalistic currency, which is what we've been talking about. They have devalued facts, which are journalistic currency, but they've also undermined trust, manufacturing consent for further curtailing press freedom. And that tends to be the way I see how online campaigns against you and other people have been. It's about, I'm borrowing the phrase, manufacturing consent. So when you're talking about the sandwich earlier, the top down and the the bottom up, that is what it is, right? Like manufacturing, so making it okay for journalists to be undermined, making it okay for lies to propagate. And that actually is all making money, for someone who might not actually even live in that country, which has been disrupted by this technology and these modes of revenue. What are your views in terms of? Because I suspect that there's an element in here that's actually about culture. And you've already hinted earlier, I think, in terms of how it exploits human nature. So what are we supposed to do then? Do we detach? Or is it really just a matter of detaching ourselves from these social media platforms? Is that enough?
You can't. Because even when you, let's just say you delete Facebook, it will still be part of it because there will be a camera that will capture you. It isn't something that I think, even as we move forward, we can't roll it back. The technology is there. And I think that's part of the reason that regulations become important. Look, I want to just add three things to what you said, and then I'll go to the solution, right? So the first is, in the last week of October, we actually helped work on a research report that was just released by Demos. It is in conjunction with NDI, the National Democratic Institute. It's called Engendering Hate, the Contours of State-Aligned Gendered Disinformation Online, right? And we show you the data and we show you how it happens. And this is important because I think that leads to the first thing you need to do. You need to understand and accept that you are being controlled by tech. Controlled is the wrong word, manipulated, because the way to fight back is to understand that and then pull back and take free will. Look, one of the biggest questions I have for myself that I'm still trying to answer is whether or not free will is even possible in the circumstances with the tech that we live with. That's why I go to, a behavior modification system, and we are Pavlov's dogs. The dogs didn't have a say in it, right? We are testing the tech. And so I guess what I'm looking for is governments to try to put the parameters to protect the users, right? This is like putting regulatory framework around air travel, around drugs. So that's the first, is understand and know what it is. I think the second thing is also understand that the business model is not the only business model possible for this technology. This particular one is extractive. It takes our behavioral data and monetizes that. That's why we become Pavlov's dogs. But there are other business models. So, for example, and this isn't a company that did all that well, right? But like in Canada, the CEO of RIM, which was behind BlackBerry, he actually began a research group because he pointed out that data is not the new oil. He said it's plutonium, that it is just as dangerous as plutonium, right? So there are other business models, and when you talk to Shoshana Zuboff, she wrote The Rise of Surveillance Capitalism. She says that this kind of extractive business model should be outlawed, like the slave trade. She points to that, right? There was a period of time when it was okay to sell people, to own people, right, based on your color. Well, that's been outlawed, right? Right. Okay. And then I would think the last one is, please understand that what we are doing, where the world is headed now with the attacks online against women, against journalists, against human rights activists, against writers. The world is headed towards a time that we've already been through, right? Some of the attacks online against me, I've shown them in different forums, and a German friend of mine said that this reminded her of how the Germans treated the Jews before the killings happened. This is not just about name calling or something that is relatively harmless, like bullying in a school. This goes beyond that. This is dehumanizing people. Dehumanizing, because in my case, they use my sex, gender, they use skin color, they use the way I speak. The goal is to dehumanize me to the point that violence is acceptable. That's where the world is headed. And that is scary. We prevented this. We said we would never do this again. So I think that's where those are the 3 points. And I think the last part of this is to go back to your question. This is not the world we want. We've already said this globally. Australia at the forefront of this. And somehow the citizens of every one of our democracies, the writers, the filmmakers, we are all going to have to ask ourselves that question that I've been forced to answer, which is, what are you willing to sacrifice for the truth? And I began asking that question when Time did that cover in 2018 of the Guardians of Truth, right? I was thinking, who are the Guardians of Truth? Yes, journalists at the first place, but in the end, every country, every generation gets the democracy it deserves. So, Australians, what kind of world do you want? What democracy do you want? And it's incumbent on each of us to do more than just vote.
Yeah. I want to finish up a bit more philosophically. Firstly, I just wanted to ask whether anything has changed about your views around what freedom even fundamentally means. Because, we're seeing the tools. I mean, let me just go back. Like, I remember when the Arab Spring happened, and I think, Twitter and Facebook were such amazing tools for activists to spread information and network. And I think there were people in Silicon Valley that internalized that and kind of ran away with it. And keeping in mind that in the US, there's really, really strong cultural attachments to ideas of free speech. And yet, ironically, those same tools that Silicon Valley invented are now being used to enforce silence. Right. This is the whole point. This is the goal, to silence not just journalists or public figures, but even ordinary people are taking a step back, locking their accounts, putting themselves on private, no longer engaging in comment threads. Which I guess is part of the picture of polarization, a withdrawal from each other. So I suppose my question is, given your experiences, given everything that you're learning have learned and are working on, do you still have faith, first of all, in your fellow Filipinos? And also whether you still believe in the capacity of civil society to correct these imbalances of power. And I think you used the word values earlier, and I want you to expand on that a bit.
So thank you for the question. There's so many strands in it, but I think the first direct answer is absolutely I have faith. I think that the values of Filipinos have been very clear. In 1986, a people power revolt removed a dictator. That took years to build up, right? But those values are there and they are codified into law. So I just hope that the problem right now is we live in an environment of violence and fear. And that environment is a decision. President Duterte, in my last interview with him in December of 2016, from the palace, he said he believes in ruling with violence and fear. It's important to him to do that. And that's the environment we live in. That is compounded by the information ecosystem we live in, where the delivery platforms actually prioritize fear, right? That is, and actually build polarity. It is in the design of the platform. So the first is, yes, we definitely, I believe that there are a lot of Filipinos who are looking at us and saying, if I speak, the same thing will happen to me. I'm a cautionary tale. But that's the reason why I'm not shutting up, because I also think that we are going to hold the line, right? We're not trying to oust the government, even though there's some really laughable matrices that the palace has released where supposedly we're mounting a coup. I wish I had an army, because I would do a better job than we would use law enforcement and the military for what it's supposed to be used for. And let me not go there, but I will say that the values are there, but people are afraid. I think the second thing you talked about, is this a free speech thing? Are the values of freedom still the same? They are absolutely the same. What's really messed it up is the fact that the technology is beyond speech. And that's why you have to look again at what the platforms say when they say this is a free speech issue. It isn't. That's like, that's just wrong, factually incorrect. The platforms are manipulating us, are choosing the realities we create for ourselves. So they're helping us create our realities. That is how powerful the technology is. So this is Sacha Baron Cohen, who's for the Anti-Defamation League. He said this is a freedom of reach issue, meaning distribution, not a freedom of speech issue. Everyone can say anything. If you gossip to your next door neighbor, it's very different.
Sacha,
yeah,
is that right? Sacha Baron Cohen, isn't that the name of a comedian?
Yes.
Is it the same person? No,
It's
you're
the
not talking
same
about
person.
the same. Oh, it is the same
The
person.
same person.
Okay, cool. I did not know that.
Borat, right? I'll send you the link. You should watch that speech, because he said he actually encapsulated it. He gets it, and he gave that speech to the Anti-Defamation League. It is, this is not a freedom of speech issue. It is about freedom of reach. So we are after them for distribution. We are after them for the filter bubbles they create, right? Because think about it like this. This technology is so powerful that it has atomized meaning. It has atomized values. And when there's no meaning, what else? How do you, even context has been robbed from us? Because if I write a piece, the piece I write will come to you in short snippets on Twitter, say, right? And snippet number one will be will be connected to the what you had for dinner or what your cousin had for dinner on your feed. The context of what we write is now determined by an algorithm, by the news feed. So these are big, big things, and I think this connects to the last part, the third. I think in threes. The third part of this is that human beings have two systems of thinking. Daniel Kahneman wrote this: thinking fast, thinking slow. And journalism, writing, governance, these are thinking slow processes because it should be based on values. And we want to make sure that we don't set dominoes tumbling, going the opposite direction, going against the values. But the very delivery platforms for information that we are using today is a thinking fast platforms. There's social media. It's thinking fast. It manipulates your emotion. It was designed to do that. So thinking fast, thinking slow. Why do things go viral here? Because even the clustering of humanity is shortened. So in the real world, there's 6 degrees of separation between us, right? In the Facebook world, it's only 3.75 degrees of separation. And that has an impact on how fast, on the virality of information. Anyway, sorry. So those are, and then I would say the last part is this. And this is where I think we can be optimistic, right? So this is really a bad place that the world is in. And it isn't just the Philippines. It isn't an other. Australia, you're doing things now that you also have to be reflective about. And we all do. So in this world that we live in today, I think we need to acknowledge its failures. And then we stand up and we say, this is what I want my world to be. And we collaborate, we do things, we join. And I guess, so the 3 pillars of Rappler are tech, journalism, and community, civil society. And that's where, the pitch of Rappler in 2012 was that we build communities of action. And the food we feed our communities is our journalism, the facts. So we have to come together now. Our values are going to be tested. If you do believe in democracy, if you believe in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you have to stand up and do something about it. Join a community that will take the real world actions that needs to happen in order to protect the world that we live in and hopefully make it better.
Yeah, under these conditions, when lies dominate, telling the truth actually becomes radical. So I totally get how you see yourself as an activist and that you don't want to be, but clearly you feel that there's a lot more on the line than your personal safety. And yeah, so it's been really, really wonderful to talk to Maria. You've been so insightful and passionate and really inspiring. Thank you so much for speaking with us. We wish you we wish you safety and strength in your path forward from this.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Mark. Mark Amal has your book. Thank you, Penn Sydney. You give us hope. You give us, you have to stay a beacon because the people who are under attack need your help.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.